Greetings, this is Eugene the Philosopher, the greatest living philosopher after the unfortunate passing of Quentin Robert de Nameland, who has been the greatest living philosopher before me. Let us talk about money for a little bit, shall we? So, as I've said in my previous videos, at least some of them, I guess one of them was the Archimedes' lever of speculation, so you might look it up if you want to. I've said that money is basically the information about the amount of good that you've done to somebody else. And of course, I mean, the good that you do to somebody else not always results in you receiving money from them. Like, I hope at least that you don't ask for money for, like, let's say, I don't know, hugging your friends or your relatives, etc. So you do some good without expecting to get any money in exchange for sometimes. But if you do that to somebody that you don't know, most of the time you do expect to get some money for that, right? So this is what I'm talking about essentially. So you do something good, like let's say you perform some work or you provide some useful items, etc. to somebody else, and they give you money in exchange, right? So therefore, the money that you have represents the amount of good that you've done to somebody else. Like the end result is pretty much that, right? So the other people then see that and they might give you something in exchange for your money on the next step, basically. That's how it works. So you need, let's say, food or a new car, or you want to have some medical services, or you want to have your streets clean, or you want to have safety, etc., and you pay for all of that, right? Although, I mean, okay, well, never mind. So yeah, so it works both ways pretty much, right? So money really is the information about the amount of good that somebody done to somebody else. Pretty much it. All right. Of course, there's a caveat here that there are certain aberrations or certain distortions, you might say, with the situation that we have currently, namely where the government controls money, right? So we have central banks, which might change the amount of money on the market just out of a whim, or how do you say, like just freely, basically, right? And we have taxation, where government just takes your money without your consent, etc., which is basically robbery. So taxation is robbery, as I've said multiple times. Well, it's a pretty famous statement from anarcho-capitalists, right? So not all money are that because of those distortions. But if you have a hypothetical completely free market, then yeah, money is just an information about the amount of good that you've done to somebody, or they done to somebody else, etc. Okay, so now I wish to talk about the sentiment that I sometimes see, not quite often, but sometimes, and which is basically the title of this video. And if you get the quote, kudos to you. But anyway, so, well, it's this sentiment, you know, that, oh, this person does this, whatever they're doing, only for the money, you know, and it's like considered to be sort of like immoral and bad and unworthy, etc. So it's like they should have done something else other than this thing that they're doing, because they're doing this despicable thing only for the money, you know, or something to that effect. So, and well, like it's quite hard to give you an example, but I guess one example, one interesting one, I guess, would be, well, at least in my youth, there was this phenomenon, so to speak, when, let's say, rock bands, at a certain stage in their career, when they become famous, they like start like writing more of a pop songs, you know, so it was considered to be a bad step, like unworthy step, when a band becomes famous and they start rock band, I mean, so they were all like indie and like underground, etc. But then they become famous and they start writing pop songs, and people say, well, they're doing it only for the money, you know, they shouldn't really do that, etc. And well, I'm not sure if I can give you examples, but well, like maybe REM with Automatic for the People, and like after that, when they become famous, etc. Or Red Hot Chili Peppers, maybe with By the Way, which is like a pop rock album, etc. Well, maybe you can come up with other examples, or maybe Radiohead, although I'm not so sure about that. Okay, so there is definitely a thing like that, like there is this sentiment somewhere, and I hope that at least intuitively you can feel that, you can sense that in our cultural field. So, and I would say it's a bad sentiment, exactly for reasons I've outlined before, like what money really is in the first place. So let me clarify. Basically, if you're getting money for something that you've done, it means that, I mean, on a voluntary basis, again, if we're not considering those crimes like taxation and involvement of government in the first place, or, well, let's say if you're not involved in some sort of questionable activities, let's say, at the very least questionable, like if you're like shooting child pornography or something, like there are certainly people who are ready to pay you for that, right? But well, that's not quite a good activity, right? Well, firstly, because it involves children who are not quite subjects, you know, so they can't really consent. So, and I've discussed this in one of my previous videos, I guess that was 2 problems of libertarianism or something like that. But if it is done, whatever it is, among consenting adults, like any sort of deal being done or any sort of activity, if you know what I mean, then there's no harm being done and it's perfectly okay. And if one of those adults or a group of adults pays the other person or group, it's perfectly fine. So I'm considering this situation, right? So if they pay them for that, then it's a pretty good activity. I mean, it means that these guys receive what they want and these guys receive money for that. So what's bad here, right? So it's just a fair voluntary exchange. All right. And so I believe that this sentiment, like they are bad because they're doing something only for the money, comes from ultimately 2 sources. And one source is very clear, but the other one is kind of more covert and not really rationalized usually. So one obvious reason is envy. Like when you see somebody doing something for the money, you envy them because, well, you know, pretty soon they're going to have a lot of money, whereas I wouldn't. So I envy them. Like these guys are successful and they receive a lot of money. So damn them, you know, something like that. Like I want to have such money also, right? Something like that. So this is pretty clear and obvious, right? But there's another reason, I believe, which is not quite as recognized as this one. And in particular, I'm talking about a sort of an elitism, I would call it, where basically you think that your values are more important than the values of whoever you're talking about and whoever is consuming the thing that this other person or collective is producing. I'm not sure I was right with the verbs here, but anyway. So basically, you state with this statement that they're only doing it for the money and therefore they're bad. You're saying that they rather should do something else which I value more than what they're doing right now only for the money, right? So this is more or less kind of expanded version of this statement, explicated, right? Like explicitly stated. something like that. So it's this elitism that, you know, oh, they're doing it only for the crowd, like to please the crowd, but I'm the elite and I know what elite wants, and they're not doing it, like they're not doing what I want, right? As the elite, they're just pleasing the crowd, therefore earning money. So this is ultimately what it boils down to, this statement. So you assume that this producer, whoever or whatever it is, must do something else instead of what they're doing right now. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. And I repeat that I believe it's a bad sentiment, it's a bad attitude, because, well, they're receiving money for it, and if it's the money that they receive voluntarily, which means like on a market basis where no one is forced to pay them for whatever they're doing, it's perfectly okay, because they, let's say, are scratching some itch, right? They're satisfying some demand with what they're doing, and it's not you're not in the position to judge those people, because, well, who are you ultimately? Like, they're not harming you with what they're doing, they're just exchanging voluntarily, so you have no right to interfere into this deal, right? So if you don't like what this person produces, it's basically your problem, ultimately. Okay? So another thing I wanted to talk about with regards to this whole discussion is obviously this hatred towards the rich that we have in our culture, and pretty much I would say every culture has. And I would say that it's understandable. Again, what I've already mentioned, envy comes into play, obviously. Like, you're saying, like, wait a minute, why do these guys have more money than I do, let's say, or somebody else does? That doesn't seem cool. Like, I want to have a lot of money also, right? That's one obvious reason for hatred of the rich, I would say. But another reason is obviously the feeling of injustice. Like, you're kind of, if you're, let's say, a more noble, like, minded person, sort of, you kind of want to everyone have their share of the pie, so to speak. So you feel it's being unfair when somebody has a lot of resources, a lot of possibilities, etc., a lot of wealth, and a lot of other people probably don't have that, right? So you feel that this is wrong, essentially. But I believe we should ask ourselves a question of, like, how did the rich became the rich in the first place? Well, if we are, like, based on what I've told you previously, they did something good to others, and in fact a lot of good, because they have a lot of money. And again, money is the information about the amount of good you've done to somebody. So if you have a lot of money, it means that you've satisfied a lot of demand previously. You've given a lot of people a lot of good stuff, basically, right? So again, if we're talking about, like, free market, right? So this sentiment about or rather this kind of stance about greedy, evil capitalists, you know, who are only about the money, etc. It only gives you one part of the picture, like one half of the picture, rather. It's only this one half of the exchange. So we have, let's say, a greedy, evil capitalist and a consumer, and the exchange goes, the greedy, evil capitalist gives the consumer something that they want, and in exchange they get money, right? So we only isolate one half of this picture where we see the greedy, evil capitalist and the money they receive. But we don't see the second half of the picture where we have a satisfied, happy consumer receiving what they want, right? So it's this sort of aberration of vision of socialists mostly, who only isolate this half of the picture. They don't see that actually the end result of the process was a satisfied consumer plus a capitalist with money. They only see the capitalist with money, right? Unfortunately, I would say. So pretty much that's what I wanted to say. And again, I wish to reiterate that there is an exception to that rule where you might become rich just because you are in some good relationships with the government. Unfortunately, again, I should add, like the government might make you rich because it has monopoly on violence. It can make you rich through lobbyism. I mean, your lobbyism in the government. You are basically utilizing the apparatus of violence of the government to promote your interests, so to get more money, essentially, right? So we have lobbyism, we have subsidies, so government might give you money, and again, government doesn't earn its own money, it just takes it away from all the citizens in that form or another, either in the form of taxes, which is robbery, well, because you cannot not pay your taxes, and you can try, but then probably rather sooner than later, silly boys in blue, to quote Alex Turner, would show up and remind you that you're wrong. Basically, you should pay your taxes. You don't have other option. Like it's really not a market deal to pay taxes for government services. They pretty much just take money away from you, right? Whether you like what they do or not. So you have no choice here. Again, subsidies. So they can give you either tax money or they can print more money through central bank, which is another monopoly. So another form of government coercion, and thus make everyone else poorer, etc., because of the inflation, etc., etc., because of the Cantillon effect, all of those things I've discussed previously. And through other regulations, like they might impose, let's say, tariffs or quotas on import, let's say. So therefore, you as a domestic company, for example, you receive privileges through that. So you get basically monopolistic status from that. Let's say you produce cars in a certain country and the government imposes like huge quotas, or rather small quotas and huge tariffs on imported cars, and therefore your position on the market gets much better, and people are forced to buy your cars rather than imported cars, just because they become much more expensive through this government coercion. And so you get a lot of benefits from that at the expense of all the people who are forced to buy your cars instead of a better and cheaper imported cars. So yeah, you're basically acting as a parasite here and not as this free market agent. So again, that all comes from the government, from this initial, let's say, from the fact that the government is based on violence, basically, and not on the voluntary free market deals. All right. And so basically what I'm saying with this is that rich people really shouldn't be hated if they got their wealth from free market deals. If they got their wealth from the government in that form or another, or at least any substantial amount of their wealth from the government, they should be hated, really, with the government. But I mean, they just played by the rules, so to speak, right? So, like, pragmatically speaking, they did nothing wrong. They just utilized the situation to their own benefit. But the situation is to be blamed for in the first place, namely the existence of government and the existence of violence and the existence of, let's say, central banks and all those regulations that the governments impose, etc., etc. But if the guy received his wealth, or a girl for that matter, from voluntary deals, then, well, they did a lot of good. I mean, if they have a lot of money, it means people voluntarily gave them money, but you don't just give someone money, you give it to people who do a lot of good to you. Well, I mean, at least some amount of good. So if you have a lot of money, it means you've done a lot of good to a lot of people, probably. So why should you hate such a person? It doesn't make any sense. And again, it's more or less a rule of thumb, at least in the Western world, well, pretty much all across the world, that rich people do charity. They're engaged in all those donation programs, etc. It's not like they're really evil, you know. It's not like they're just sitting on a chest of gold like a proverbial dragon or whatever. They're actually doing stuff, and they invest in other companies and they help other people out, etc. And it's not like if you have like $1 billion that you just over consume, you know. It's a completely different level of existence, you know. You are involved in all those projects and other businesses, etc., etc. So yeah, but I mean, when people hate bankers, that's completely understandable because they are involved in this monopolistic industry of money production, right? I mean, monopolized by the government. So they really get their money out of thin air, basically. That's really the case. I mean, in the current system. So they are not really good people, I would say, in this respect at least. So yeah, so basically, I guess my point would be that the money that you receive from the government is dirty money, because it's the money basically it's a result of a crime in that way or another, of a robbery, essentially. So as much as you detest, let's say, a robber who buys an expensive car or a huge house for themselves, just to that same degree, you should hate people who received money from the government. Because it's the money that was taken from everyone else, fundamentally. All right. So I guess to conclude this rant, I would say that, well, again, I would end with this moralistic note, more or less, that you shouldn't probably judge what other people do. Again, if they get money for whatever they're doing, it means they're doing something good to somebody else. And if you're not involved in this process, if you don't like it, it's your own problem, essentially. I mean, you're free to be enraged, to be, I don't know, offended by this situation, but again, ultimately, it's your own problem. And the only exception to that rule would be when the deal is made involuntary, which again, I've given you example with children who can't really voluntarily choose. But again, I refer to my video, 2 Problems of Libertarianism, for more details. Or if you're involved in crime. So if you get your money from crime, or I mean, if anyone gets their money from crime, like if they've robbed someone, let's say, and become rich through that, well, this is a bad money, right? It's a bad act. So they shouldn't really be rich. I mean, look at Russian oligarchs who got rich just because of let's say, well, there was a deliberate operation to rob the whole country, basically, to get those, well, let's say, factories that were built in the Soviet Union by pretty much the whole nation, right? Sometimes by slave labor, like, you know, those Stalin era factories, etc. So they've privatized those factories because they've had connections to the government. And they still do have these connections because, well, everyone knows that this property is acquired in a criminal manner, right? So this is the bane of a private property in Russia, that all the major oligarchs, all the major industrial and financial actors are criminals, and everyone knows that. And the centralized power in Russia, the government, they kind of have this tool of blackmailing oligarchs and those rich people. So they utilize them to their own ends, and so this is basically the power structure in Russia, and in my country to a large degree also, and in many other countries, I think, too. Anyway, yeah, so basically, rich people, if they got rich on the market, are good people. If they got rich because of their ties to government, they're bad people. Well, maybe they're not bad people, but they did bad things. the very, I mean, fact that they got rich because of this crime. I mean, because of the crimes that the governments do. This is not a good thing. But in general, we're only in it for the money is a good stance, and it's not very healthy to let's say, to dislike that, well, because it's none of your business, essentially. If people like it, they consume it, they pay money for it, and it's none of your business. All right, thank you for watching. The eons are closing.